The town of Marrow's End was the kind of place maps forgot on purpose. It sat in the crook of two ridges, folded under a sky that looked like old Papperthin, creased, slightly yellowed at the corners. People who lived there liked those seams. They liked the way the town kept its own hours and the way the fog collected around the shuttered bakery at dawn like a pet. There were two churches sown with a bell that never tolled and another with a clock that stopped at 3:17, and a row of houses so close their eaves nearly touched. At the lane's end stood the Hollow House, a squat, stubborn thing with shutters like folded hands and a porch that seemed to frown. Children dared one another to touch its stoop. Teenagers parked cars in the lane and smoked and laughed in sharp bursts about who could sit longest on the porch swing and pretend not to be afraid. The adults told stories over hedges and porches about Hester Knight, a midwife who once lived there and who kept secrets like coins in jars. If your baby lived, you left a ribbon. If it did not, you left nothing, and people watched. The story rearranged itself depending on the teller. Sometimes Hester was miracle worker, sometimes witch, sometimes a woman who had learned that small towns survive by a private economy of favors and omissions. No one had lived in the Hollow House for 3 generations, and that suited Marrow's End fine. People liked to imagine the house as a cupboard of unspent things, old dolls, a piano that had been closed against noise, a stack of letters, photographs curled like dried petals. They liked to picture it patient and dusty. Then, after a long ruin of rain and fog, the Hollow House changed hands. Evelyn Price arrived with a car that rattled along like an old argument, and a head full of an academic's hobbyist ledgers, marginalia, other people's pasts rendered tidy. She specialized in cataloging small histories, parish records, rent books, the quiet violence of municipal minutes. She moved because her marriage had ended in small, precise ways, and because cities sometimes make grief too loud. Marrow's End offered the kind of silence that felt like permission to unpack, permission to rearrange. The Hollow House sat at the end of Hollow Lane like an old sentence. Hedges had been allowed to fester into thickets. Windows were boarded with planks crossed in hasty X, as if someone had tried to stop light from coming through. A brass knocker shaped like an owl hung at the door, and when Evelyn pressed it, the sound that traveled across the wood was dry and final, like a single coin dropped into a well. She moved in with a plan. She cleared rooms with the same economy she used to clear archive shelves, remove, catalog, store. She hung lights that made the ceilings look less cavernous. She found small notes tucked behind skirting board shelf, a recipe, a child's rhyme. The words not yet on a scrap of paper, and cataloged them in a ledger that felt like an altar. Date, item, location, remark. It was work that calmed her. It was a way to make things accountable. On her third night, a sound woke her, a low, staccato tapping that seemed to come from within the plaster itself. Evelyn traced it the way a historian follows a clue. Beneath the sitting room wallpaper, she found thin incisions in the lath, tiny marks repeated, carefully spaced, as if someone had been counting. The lines formed numbers and initials: K. 12, JT. 9, man felt as alive as fingerprints. She chalked them in her notebook. The rational part of her offered sensible explanations: previous renovations, a child's habit, a mason's mark. But another part, the old small voice that kept her up over marginally, felt a prickle of attention. Names have weight. They hold shape. The house's second sound came 3 nights later, a slow dragging, like a fingernail pulled along the inside of a bowl. Evelyn traced it to the parlor. The piano sat there, its keys a ragged mouth. When she lifted the lid, she found the mechanism hollowed of hammers and felt as if whatever music it knew had been removed. On the underside of the lid, in faded pencil, were words: keep the names. We will come for the tally. The handwriting slanted like someone who had been careful with language, because language had been their business. She slept badly after that, waking with the impression the house listened. Neighbors came with casseroles and suspicious affectionates. Kate's with lavender sachets, Tom Muir with a jar of pickle sand. They gave warnings folded into pies. Hollow places take what you feed them, Mrs. Kate said, voice low as a secret. Evelyn smiled and wrote it down as fieldwork. A scholar's instinct is to demystify. Then the house asked a question. It began in photographs. Beneath the stairs, Evelyn found a sacking-wrapped box smelling of peat. Inside were snapshot sepia, curled with people who might have been grandparents she never met, a woman with luminous eyes, a child clutching a doll missing an eye. On the backs were names in different hands and, on one, a phrase that tightened her chest, given LR keep. She made notes. The initials recurred in the lath tally marks. LR appeared at intervals. Someone had at different points written keep, return, and sometimes left an empty space like a pause. That night the tapping changed rhythm. For taps, too. Through the wood she heard speech, old syllables braided with wind. Give us the list, the voice seemed to say, muffled as if through cotton. Evelyn laughed into the dark and returned to her ledger, writing, found, box of photographs, observations, repeated initials, possible ritual tally. Days folded into a pattern. Photographs shifted places. One on the mantel when she had left it on the piano. Another inside her jacket pocket. Small things vanished, a brass thimble. A button and reappeared as offerings. A neighbor's dog asleep on the parlor rug. A child's shoe on the pillow. The house traded, and what it took had a logic. It wanted tokens with stories. Evelyn's ledger grew. The marks in the lath multiplied. The house's appetite was not a hunger for riches, but for names, and the attachments they carried. She followed those names into parish records as if tracing a migratory route. L.R. was Lottie Rouse, born 1912, a midwife's assistant. J.T. led to Jacob Tomlin and a ledger that recorded births and deaths with a clinical absence. A remarks column where entries read unattended, no father present, and once, repeatedly. Kept. The word kept read like a footnote to fate. Evelyn found herself shuttling late into the university archive, microfilm humming like distant insects. Her notes became thinner and more urgent. When she asked Mrs. Cates what kept meant, the old woman's face folded into the patient ferocity of memory. Sometimes they took names, she said. Sometimes they took things. And once, when a woman had nothing, they took a memory. The house Hester's work, it's not spiteful like people think. It's efficient. It collects scarcity. Collects, Evelyn said. The term sounded clinical in her mouth. Mrs. Cates put down a bag of sugar. You keep things so others can keep living. Back then we didn't have pity on a ledger. We traded. It's how a town keeps a roof. Evelyn had come to the Hollow House to catalog pasts, not to become an exhibit. But the house's ledger pulled at her like gravity. One morning a photograph of a baby lay on the mantel. On the back, in a script she recognized from the parish register, the note said, given, E. Price keep. She had not been born in Marrow's End. She had no memory of this house as a child. The photograph prickled in her palm like an accusation. Had someone, some midwife or neighbor, written her name into the house's accounts? Before she could consent, the idea startled her in ways that made reason recede. The house's tendency to name and bind blurred with her own history, until she felt less like a resident and more like ledgered property. Small prices came first: a teaspoon, a hair ribbon, a child's drawing. She handed them over like feeding a stray. The house's tally clenched and grew. She tried to refuse, wedging a box of photographs beneath a crawlspace and bracing it with a chair. The tapping escalated, a chorus of household things sounding out in the new weather. She dreamed of rooms made entirely of names, stacked like plates that might topple. In the dream a figure of paper and ink approached and said, "You are the name you keep." Refusing the house produced consequences. Her mother, who had driven down for a visit, suddenly could not recall the names of streets she had navigated since she was young. A neighbor's boy left his spelling book and forgot letters he had known. People laughed it off as fog or fatigue. But Evelyn felt a thread linking the house to the forgetting, an appetite that spread. A child knocked at her door one evening, rain on his shoes and a wooden horse gripped to his chest. He had found the toy by the river, he said. "Can you keep it?" he asked, innocent and practical in the way only children are. Evelyn hesitated. She had returned a photograph once and seen its ripple of relief and took the horse. The house accepted it. That night a photograph of the child's family was beneath her pillow, their faces a notch in the ledger without the child's name on their lips. Then the house's requests became heavier. Not trinkets, but memory weights. A neighbor forgot an anniversary. A baker lost the recipe everyone had loved. Small erasures multiplied. The ledger's margins filled with notations like easing of bearer, 3 days. Local amnesia, partial. Evelyn tried to counteract it by returning items when she could. Once, she tracked a photograph back to the grandmother of the boy with the wooden horse and handed it over. The woman cried and pressed the photograph to her chest as if it were a pulse. For a time the forgetting eased, but the house adjusted. It reached beyond objects to names in the world, living people whose remembering sustained families. A mother would blank on a child's middle name. An elderly man would forget the face of his brother. Forgetting was thinned and scattered like ash. The ledger tightened like a noose. The house had learned that names are currency. To hold a name is to move the town's balance. Evelyn felt the role of keeper pressing into her. People slid envelopes under her door. They asked her to deal with things. She learned to weigh the cost each time. To keep this photograph would spare a family grief, but bind the memory to the house. To return it might restore someone's remembering, but invite the ledger's hunger for an offset. She grew blunt and practical about mercy, recording outcomes in columns. Item kept, effect observed. The columns filled until they bent like the spines of old books. She tried negotiation. She staged gatherings in her parlor, a few neighbors and the persistent, practical-minded. A chorus of voices learning to speak the names aloud. They read recipes, recited the names of streets, rehearsed births and birthdays until the air felt full and less appetizing to a thing that fed on silence. Children learned to sing names like charms. Bakery owners stamped initials into loaves. It was clumsy, sincere, and it bought them breathing room. In the quiet hours, Evelyn discovered another ledger tucked behind a loose panel. The Hollow House's own account book. Its pages were thin as breath, ink faded, columns counting names beside dates. It catalogued exchanges made in older times when the town could not spare charity. Without a trade breast fighting for rent, a favor for a favor, a memory for medicine. Hester Knight's hand had left terse annotations, kept reserved for village and, in a different ink, binding, necessary. Confronted with those entries, Evelyn understood the house as both jailer and archivist. It was a device born of necessity, a method of hiding the rawness of survival. With a ledger as neat as a show box. But ledgers ask for a keeper. Someone must take on the accounting. She resisted for a while, but resistance in small towns is costly. She watched neighbors' memories fray and rallied them to read aloud at gatherings, and tape names to photographs. She taught bakers and midwives the practice of doubling labels. She learned to write in the Hollow House's thin hand, tracing the incisions in the lath and making notes that could be read by people and, perhaps, by the house itself. The act of naming out loud spread the weight. When a name moved through the town, it seemed to lose the singular gravity that made it delectable. Years folded. Evelyn grew practiced. She became, in small and exhausting ways, the town's ledger keeper and its activist. The woman who would take a photograph for safekeeping when a family feared disgrace, and who would press it between pages and mark in the ledger the terms of the trade. She learned the arithmetic of compassion, what to keep and what to return, how to measure the consequences. She mended what she could and made careful notes. The Hollow House's tapping never quite stopped, but it became less like a demand and more like a clock marking dues paid and dues outstanding. People argued she had bargained with a thing no one should trust, that she had become complicit in theft. Others said she had been a steward, the person who learned to manage an inconvenient system without letting it devour the living. Both were true. The ledger eroded Evelyn's edges. Her hands trembled in old age like pages turning. She slept sometimes with the ledger at her bedside, its spine softened from handling. She had kept so many names that she could feel them line her ribs. On her last night she sat at her desk and wrote a single line across the ledger's last clean page. Keep the names. Give them room to live. It was less a command than a plea. She left the book in a drawer for the next person, folded the town's manners into ink, and slept. After she died, townspeople said she had been the only one who could read the Hollow House's ledger. Some called her saint, some a complicity. Children still dared each other to touch the stoop. Teenagers still laughed in bursts. But there was a practice now that made the house's appetite less voracious. Names were spoken aloud, recipes recited, photos labeled in ink and tape and duplicate notes. People handed Eve's ledger from hand to hand when necessary. The hollow house still tapped in the walls on windless nights, but sometimes on those nights a neighbor would stand at their window and say a name so the sound traveled and diluted and lost the singularity that once made it desirable. The town never fully rid itself of the ledger's need. Nothing that long-standing slides away cleanly, but the community learned the cost of keeping and the virtue of sharing memory as a small, practical defense. The hollow house remained at Hollow Lane's end, patient as a cupboard, and sometimes it still rearranged photographs. When that happened, someone would gather the street and read all the labels aloud, so the house could not fold a name into a secret alone. Evelyn's ledger is kept now in the town's small museum, taught by a woman who learned Evelyn's method of careful naming. A faded line, added by an unknown hand, reads, "We keep, but do not steal the heart that remembers." No one knows whether Hester Knight ever intended kindness or merely efficiency. Both live in the same house. Children run past the porch with borrowed courage. Couples in love post names on bread tags and tape them to frames. The hollow house taps its old rhythm. Sometimes the tap becomes a memory's metronome. Sometimes it is just wood settling. On the nights when the moon is low and the fog rolls in like someone breathing through a shawl, a hush gathers on Hollow Lane. People step outside and call the names they carry. The sound moves through the town like a small, steady tide, not a bargain or a bargain's end, but a community attempting to hold its own story together so the house, if it must keep, cannot keep it all alone.